Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Harrison, and welcome back to Introduction to Finance. Today, we're answering a question every business owner eventually runs into. What happens the moment you hire somebody to run the company that you own? It used to be that running a business and owning a business were the same thing. But once companies get large enough, it's not the same thing anymore. Typically, the owners are somewhere else, and they have somebody that they hired to make the decisions for them. So, what happens when the person making the decisions isn't the person who bears the consequences? That's exactly what our problem focuses on today. In Part A, it says the founder of a company retires and hires a professional CEO, keeping all of her shares. Why does an agency relationship now exist that didn't before, and who is the principal and who is the agent? So, what's happened here is that our founder has hired somebody else to run the company for her. When she does this, she now still owns the company, but she's not the one making the day to day decisions that keep the company going. So, it's possible that the manager can actually end up doing things that the owner would not want them to do. The reason for this is because the person making the decisions and the person that bears the consequences are not the same person anymore. This problem, which is called a principal agent problem, arises whenever someone hires someone else to do something for them. In a principal agent relationship, somebody, the principal, ends up hiring someone else, the agent, to do something for them. So, for example, the principal in our problem is the founder of the company who just retired. The agent is the CEO that they just hired to do the work for them. And as we'll see in a moment, there's a lot of ways that a CEO can try and take advantage of this principal agent relationship. Part B. 2 years in, the CEO flies first class everywhere. He has the same company sponsor his favorite golf tournament, and he turns down risky but profitable expansions because a failure might cost him his job. The board of the company responds by hiring an outside auditor, and they rewrite his contract so half his pay is stock and can't be sold for 5 years. We need to identify the agency costs here and label them as direct or indirect. So before we can do this problem, we need to identify what these terms actually mean. First, we have an agency cost, which is basically any cost that comes out of the gap between what the owner wants and what the manager wants, and they come in two different kinds. First, we have a direct agency cost, which is money that actually leaves the company's hands because of that gap. For example, if the CEO decides to get the nice bottle of wine instead of the cheap one at dinner, even though they're not supposed to, that's a direct agency cost because it's money leaving the company's pocket. Then we have an indirect agency cost, which is the value that the owner loses because of what the manager did or did not do. So here, nothing actually gets spent. Nothing gets recorded anywhere, and the company is just worth less than it would have been because of what the manager did. So, for example, if the manager is sitting down and playing fantasy football all day instead of actually working when he's in the office, that would be an indirect cost because there isn't actually money leaving the company's hands, but the company is actually being hurt by it. The manager isn't getting the work done that they're supposed to. So, with these two definitions, let's sort out the four items that we have in our problem. First, we have the first class flights. These are going to be a direct cost. The company is directly paying for the more expensive flights, causing the money to actually leave the company's hands. Similarly, the golf sponsorship is cash that's leaving the company's hands, so it's an example of a direct cost. The rejected expansion is the one that people tend to miss. What's happened here is that the company did not end up going through with a potentially profitable expansion project. The reason being that the manager wanted to make sure that they still have a job. So, in some sense, the company is worse off because it did not go through with this expansion. So, what we have here is an example of an indirect agency cost, where money doesn't leave the company's hands, but the company is worse off because of the manager's actions. So, how did the board respond and try to get the manager to fall back in line? Well, they responded in two ways. First, they hired an outside auditor to monitor the CEO and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. This cost is money leaving the company, so it's a direct agency cost. And the idea is that by hiring the monitor, this direct agency cost will end up being smaller than the ones that the CEO would have gotten away with. The second thing that they do is they rewrite the company's contract with the CEO, and they make it so that the CEO's incentives are more aligned with that of the company. How did they do this? Notice that they made it so the CEO had stock in the company. The question is, what's the best way to make a CEO follow what the shareholders want? Well, the answer is to make them a shareholder themselves. However, notice one detail in how this contract works. Half his pay is in stock, and he cannot sell that stock for 5 years. If he could sell the stock immediately, it would effectively be like giving him cash, because it can just convert to cash very simply. However, because there's this lockup and the CEO has to keep the stock for 5 years, it forces them to care about what the shares are going to be worth in 5 years, which is exactly what an owner cares about. Part C. Besides compensation design, let's name two other forces that can push managers to act in the shareholders' best interest and explain the mechanisms for each. The first mechanism is the threat of takeovers. If management runs a company badly, then what's going to happen? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is that the price of the stock is going to drop. And when that happens, it actually opens up the opportunity for someone to come in and buy the company for cheap. Then, when the new owner comes in, they'll fire the old management that wasn't performing well and install someone who's going to actually fall in line with what the shareholders want. In doing so, they can then push the price back up and make themselves a profit. So, if a manager falls too far out of line, then a takeover could happen and end up removing them from their position. The second mechanism is oversight, and that runs through the board of directors and through shareholders voting their shares. Generally speaking, shareholders elect the board, and the board can fire the CEO. And a large enough amount of shareholders can run a proxy fight to change out the board and even the CEO entirely. So, if they end up falling too far out of line with the beliefs of the shareholders, then there's a direct channel that they can go through to actually end up removing them. So, what did we actually learn today? We learned four things worth keeping. The first is that an agency relationship shows up anytime ownership and control are separated. Because we have this separation of ownership and control, the principal and the agent are going to have different incentives on what they want to do. This directly leads to agency costs. The second thing we learned is that direct agency costs are the ones that you can point at with an invoice. They're things that the company spent on that they shouldn't have spent on otherwise if the manager was acting in the company's best interest. Third, we also learned that there are indirect agency costs, which are ones that result from the action or inaction of the CEO that end up hurting the company without any direct price point. Then finally, we know that we can never completely eliminate agency costs. The only thing we can do is choose which kind we're going to pay. Specifically, monitoring is a great example of this. If you watch the CEO constantly, you're going to be able to prevent them from moving outside of the company's best interests. However, you're going to have to pay whoever's monitoring the CEO. The trade-off is deciding which of these costs you want to pay.